In the humid, heavy air of a Sydney autumn, the suburbs usually settle into a predictable rhythm of sprinkler systems and late-night grocery runs. North Rocks is the kind of place where people pay a premium for silence. It is a labyrinth of leafy streets and mid-century brick apartments where anonymity is a commodity. But in May, the silence in one particular unit began to vibrate with a different kind of energy. It wasn't the frantic desperation of a street-level dealer, but the meticulous, almost corporate focus of an international startup. Inside, two men, one 61, the other 27, were overseeing a logistics operation that defied the most basic rules of the criminal underworld. They weren't just playing with fire. They were selling the matches to people who were already burning. The 61-year-old was a man who understood the value of a facade. At his age, he didn't look like a kingpin. He looked like a grandfather who might spend his afternoons complaining about the price of petrol. His younger associate provided the mobility, the digital footprint, and the nervous energy required to move through a city that never stops watching. Together, they represented a bridge between the old-school grit of Sydney's past and the polished, globalized crime of the present. Their business model was deceptively simple. They had established a connection with a South American syndicate, or at least, they had established the appearance of one. Intelligence suggested a shipment had arrived from Spain, 95 kilograms of high-purity cocaine. In the world of organized crime, that much weight is more than just product. It is a declaration of war or an invitation to a feast. The genius of their plan, or perhaps its fatal flaw, lay in the composition of the product. The bricks were heavy, tightly wrapped, and professional in every aesthetic detail. To the naked eye, they were indistinguishable from the fuel that drives the nightlife of the eastern suburbs. But these bricks were built on a foundation of baking powder and deception. They were selling a ghost. In a marketplace where a single gram can cost hundreds of dollars and a slight insult can result in a drive-by shooting, these two men were charging $90,000 per kilogram for something that belonged in a pantry. It was a gamble of staggering proportions. They weren't just thieves, they were magicians, performing for an audience of wolves. While the duo orchestrated their sales, they remained unaware that the silence of North Rocks had been compromised. The State Crime Command's Organized Crime Squad had already birthed Strikeforce Booker. Detectives weren't just looking for drugs. They were tracking a pattern of movement that didn't fit the neighborhood. Surveillance teams, parked in unremarkable cars, watched the apartment. They noted the visitors, the late-night arrivals, and the departure of couriers who believed they were carrying the keys to a fortune. The police were operating on the assumption that they were tracking a major international import. They saw the money moving stacks of Australian currency, bundles of euros, and the digital ghost trails of cryptocurrency. It looked like a titan of an operation, a sophisticated machine with gears turning in London and Madrid. The tension within the apartment was likely a physical presence. Selling fake drugs to ordinary people is a scam. Selling fake drugs to established criminal networks is a suicide note. Yet, the duo had already been successful. They had allegedly fleeced 4 separate syndicates in Sydney since May. Each transaction was a ticking time bomb. The buyers, often violent men with their own hierarchies and enforcers, would eventually cut into the bricks. They would realize the high-grade powder didn't react to the heat or the chemical tests. They would realize they had been robbed of hundreds of thousands of dollars by a man who looked like he should be retiring. The 61-year-old didn't seem to care about the inevitable fallout. He moved with a calm that suggested he had done this before. perhaps in the grey streets of London earlier in the year. He relied on the fact that in the underworld, when you get ripped off, you don't call the police, you handle it internally. He was banking on the pride and the secrecy of his victims to keep him safe. It was a psychological masterclass in exploitation. He knew that the very men he was cheating were the ones least likely to admit they had been fooled by a pair of suburban scammers. As June approached, the air grew colder and the surveillance sharpened. The detectives of Strikeforce Booker were no longer just observing. They were waiting for the moment of maximum density, the point where the cash and the drugs were in the same room. By the night of June 11th, the apartment in North Rocks was no longer a home. It was a vault. Inside were 10 compressed blocks of white powder and a mountain of evidence that pointed toward a global reach. There were 14 mobile phones, a graveyard of SIM cards, and ledgers that detailed a life lived in the margins of the law. At 8:15 p.m., the quiet of the North Rocks street was shattered. The heavy thud of a battering ram against a reinforced door is a sound that marks the end of a trajectory. The tactical officers who poured into the apartment were prepared for a shootout, for the violent defense of a 95-kilogram fortune. They found the cash, $121,000 in a single pile, and the tools of the trade. They found the men, their hands forced behind their backs as the reality of the situation set in. The younger man's adrenaline must have been surging, while the 61-year-old likely watched with a weary detachment. But as the forensic teams began their work, a strange realization began to dawn on the investigators. The preliminary tests for cocaine were coming back negative. 1 brick, then 2, then all 10. The high-tech laboratory equipment was confirming what the scammers already knew. There wasn't a single gram of illicit substance in the entire haul. The police had raided a drug fortress and found a bakery. Yet, the law in New South Wales is indifferent to the quality of the lie. If you represent a substance as an illegal drug, the handcuffs fit just as tightly. The duo was charged with supplying a large commercial quantity of a prohibited drug, regardless of the fact that the drug was inert. While the North Rocks duo was being processed, another shadow was growing in the west of the city. A different kind of counterfeit empire was being built, one that didn't rely on powder, but on the vanity of the digital age. In the suburbs of Fairfield East and Guildford, a new generation of criminals had realized that you didn't need to sell poison to make millions. You just needed to sell a dream. They were trading in Rolexes and Cartier, items that whispered of status and wealth, but their origin was far from the boutiques of Paris or Switzerland. These were the architects of a $10 million mirage, and like the men in North Rocks, they believed they were too clever to be caught in the net of the law. The aftermath of the North Rocks raid left a peculiar vacuum in the local news cycle. While the public marveled at the sheer audacity of selling baking powder to international cartels, the investigators of Strikeforce Raptor were already pivoting. They knew that in a city like Sydney, greed is rarely isolated to a single apartment. It flows through the fiber optic cables and settles in the manicured suburbs of the West. In places like Fairfield East and Maryland, the criminal landscape had shifted. It was no longer about back alley handoffs or clandestine meetings in parking lots. The new frontier was digital, draped in the aesthetic of high fashion and filtered through the glossy lens of Instagram. A 3-year-old man from Fairfield East understood this better than most. He wasn't interested in the volatile world of chemicals. He was interested in the psychology of status. Along with his associates, he had spent years perfecting a different kind of counterfeit, the luxury lifestyle. To the casual observer on social media, they were the ultimate success story. Their feeds were a curated stream of Rolex watches, Cartier bracelets, and Louis Vuitton bags. They moved through life with the unearned confidence of the ultra-rich, claiming to be importers of fine goods or high-end resellers. But the reality was far more industrial. They were the architects of a shadow economy, moving thousands of high-quality replicas from overseas factories directly into the hands of a public desperate to look wealthier than they were. The scale of the operation was staggering. By the time the NSW Crime Commission and the State Crime Command combined to form Task Force Alcoa, the syndicate had allegedly moved nearly $10 million worth of goods. This wasn't a small-time side hustle. It was a multi-platform retail empire. They utilized the anonymity of encrypted messaging and the reach of Facebook Marketplace to connect with a client base that spanned the entire country. The money didn't just sit in shoeboxes. It was layered with professional precision. Small amounts were moved through a web of accounts, disappearing into the legitimate banking system before resurfacing as tangible, undeniable wealth. In the world of organized crime, the layering phase is where the most significant mistakes happen. People who grow up with nothing often struggle to hide the fact that they now have everything. The syndicate members couldn't resist the allure of the very status they were faking for others. While they sold imitation bags for a few $100s, they were buying the real thing for themselves, but on a much larger scale. The money from thousands of fake watches was being funneled into a fleet of vehicles that acted as rolling neon signs for the police. When you live in a modest suburb and park a Lamborghini in the driveway, you aren't just showing off to your neighbors. You are inviting the government to audit your soul. The investigation was a slow burn of digital forensics and financial tracking. Detectives weren't just looking for the warehouse. They were looking for the unexplained wealth. Under New South Wales law, the burden of proof shifts in these cases. If you are caught with a $3 million car collection and no record of legitimate employment, the state doesn't have to prove where the money came from. You have to prove it didn't come from crime. It is a legal pincer movement that strips away the assets before the handcuffs even click. By mid-June, Task Force Alcoa had seen enough. The digital trails had converged on 3 specific addresses in Fairfield East, Maryland, and Guilford. The morning of June 18th was crisp, the kind of winter day where the sun is bright but provides no heat. At 8:30 a.m., the Southwest Metropolitan Regional Operations Support Group coordinated a synchronized strike. These weren't subtle entries. They were massive deployments, designed to overwhelm the suspects before they could delete their digital histories or flush their SIM cards. Inside the properties, the contrast was jarring. One room would be filled with cheap cardboard boxes containing hundreds of imitation designer goods, plastic-wrapped dreams for the masses, while the garage held the reality of the profit. Seized 9 vehicles that morning. The collection included multiple Lamborghinis and a Mercedes-AMG, a fleet valued at over $3 million. They also found $270,000 in cold cash and a gel blaster, a toy designed to look like a lethal weapon, fitting for a crew whose entire existence was built on imitation. But it was the documents and the devices that held the real weight. One man in Guildford allegedly refused to comply with an order to unlock his phone, a desperate, final attempt to keep the encrypted gates closed. It was a futile gesture. The digital footprints had already been mapped, and the bank accounts had been frozen. As the suspects were led into the Granville police station, the gravity of the Crime Commission's involvement began to sink in. They weren't just facing charges of dealing with the proceeds of crime. They were facing the total liquidation of their lives. The luxury cars, the symbols of their success, were loaded onto flatbed trucks to be sold at auction, the proceeds eventually destined for the state's coffers. It was a total dismantling of a $10 million mirage. Yet, while the police were celebrating this victory against the economy of the fake, a far darker reality was simmering in the legal corridors of South Australia. There, the consequences of crime weren't measured in luxury cars or counterfeit bags, but in the life of an innocent man and a legal error that was about to set 7 violent men free. The shift from the sterile interrogation rooms of Sydney to the legal landscape of Adelaide is a transition from the predictable to the precarious. In the world of law enforcement, a conviction is often viewed as the final period at the end of a long, exhausting sentence. But for the family of Jason Daiso, that period was recently scrubbed away by a judicial eraser. Daiso was a man whose life was defined by the tangible and the honest, the smell of engine oil, the weight of a wrench, the steady rhythm of a mechanic's workshop in Puraka. He was 33 years old, a man with no criminal record, no gang affiliations, and no enemies. He was the statistical anomaly that haunts every police department, the truly innocent victim caught in the crossfire of a war he didn't know was happening. On a Tuesday morning in November 2012, that war arrived at his doorstep in the form of a stolen vehicle and a cold-blooded executioner. It was a targeted hit, choreographed with a chilling lack of regard for witnesses or security cameras. The gunmen weren't there for Jason. They were looking for a high-ranking member of the Finks Motorcycle Club who had been at the workshop only minutes prior. In the distorted logic of a gang feud, being in the proximity of a rival is often enough of a death warrant. Jason was shot dead in his own garage, a brutal ending that sent ripples of fear through a community that believed suburban workshops were safe havens. For over a decade, the case was a jigsaw puzzle of silence and intimidation. Investigating outlaw motorcycle gangs, OMCGs, like the Hells Angels and the Finks, is akin to interrogating a brick wall. The Code of Omerta is enforced with more consistency than any statute of the state. Yet, through years of painstaking surveillance, forensic digital mapping, and the slow erosion of loyalties, the Major Crime Investigation Branch built a case against 7 men. These weren't just street soldiers. They were the core of a local Hells Angels chapter brothers, candidates, and associates who allegedly operated as a single violent organism. In 2023, after a 5-month trial that tested the limits of the South Australian Supreme Court, the jury returned a verdict that felt like a definitive victory. All 7 men were sentenced to life imprisonment. The prosecution had relied on the joint enterprise doctrine, a legal framework that allows the state to hold every member of a group accountable for a crime if they all shared a common purpose that made the ultimate violence a foreseeable outcome. It is a powerful tool designed to dismantle the "I was just the driver" defense that criminals have used for a century. For a moment, it seemed the ghost of Jason Daiso had finally found rest. However, the legal system possesses a self-correcting mechanism that can be as indifferent as it is precise. The 7 men appealed, and the Court O.F. Criminal Appeal began to dismantle the instructions given to the jury. The flaw wasn't in the evidence, but in the nuance of how the law was explained. The justices ruled that the trial judge had erred in guiding the jury on the specific requirements of extended joint enterprise. To convict a group for a murder committed by one individual, the prosecution must prove that each member foresaw the possibility of a killing during the commission of a lesser crime, like assault. The appellate court found the instructions. The transition from the solemn courtrooms of Adelaide back to the chaotic pulse of the streets is a reminder that in the underworld, justice is often a luxury concept. While lawyers argue over legal doctrines, the reality of violence continues, often fueled by a lethal combination of incompetence and miscalculation. The peak of this chaos isn't found in grand international conspiracies, but in a bungled kidnapping in Huntfield Heights, a testament to how gang brutality often goes hand in hand with a laughable lack of preparation. On a Tuesday evening in June, a 4-year-old man stood outside the shops at Huntfield Heights, an ordinary citizen enjoying the quiet of dusk. He had no idea he had fallen into the sights of a group that included Bone, a motorcycle gang member looking to settle a debt. With no verification and no due diligence, the group forced the victim into a silver Mitsubishi Triton in broad daylight. This wasn't a sophisticated abduction. It was an outburst of blind aggression. The vehicle sped frantically down the Southern Expressway, turning a routine commute into a tool of psychological torture. Inside, the victim faced threats over a debt he had never heard of. When the car finally stopped at Sports Park Drive, the aggression turned into action. The victim was brutally beaten, a broken jaw, shattered teeth, and a disfigured nose. It was only after looking at the young man's bloodied face that the kidnappers realized the horrifying truth. They had the wrong person. A dead silence fell over the scene as the reality of their error set in. But the physical and psychological damage to the innocent man was already irreversible. The irony of this incident lies in the fact that while major gangs like the Rebels MC try to maintain an image of discipline and power, individuals like Bone expose the rot within. In Canberra, over 100 Rebels members gathered at the Greyhound Club to flex their muscle, but found themselves surrounded by a police fishbowl. Every roar of a Harley-Davidson engine was met with the unwavering gaze of Strikeforce Raptor. The membership drop from 450 to 100 inches a single year is an unmistakable signal. The empire of noise is being suffocated by its own display. In Queensland, another 2-year-old was learning the lesson of inevitability. In an apartment on Sandown Close, Edmonton police discovered a massive haul of cannabis and cash. Footage from the raid revealed a scene both pathetic and absurd. Stacks of cash, totaling tens of thousands of dollars, being pulled from inside filthy garbage bins and hidden within everyday household items. It is the perfect microcosm of the criminal life fast money that ends with you hiding your spoils among the trash, waiting for the knock on the door that never fails to come. Back in court, Bone's lawyer attempted to paint a picture of a damaged soul, citing mental health issues following the tragic suicide of a former partner. Yet, the trauma of the innocent victim, who suffered broken bones over a mistaken name, remained an undeniable reality. The judge allowed bail under strict conditions, but that freedom is only temporary, a lull before the legal system completes its slow but grinding rotation. As night falls across the Australian states, from the apartments in North Rocks to the workshops in Poraka, a clear truth emerges. The fake drug dealers might fool a few syndicates, the counterfeit bag sellers might drive Lamborghinis for a few months, and gang members might escape sentencing on technicalities. But they are all living in a state of the unfinished. The cash hidden in trash cans, the compressed blocks of baking powder, and the overturned convictions are all just pieces of a game where the players always lose in the end. Sydney moves on. The luxury cars are towed away, and in the shadows of the alleys, someone else is starting a new plan, entirely unaware that they are already the next blip on a radar screen, being watched from the other side of the street.